So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's English Catholic History Association talk by Joshua Madrid, which is entitled, God Pickle You Gentlemen, Preserving English Catholicism in the Second World War. So, I'll just do a quick bio for him. So this is about the speaker this evening. Joshua Madrid is a PhD candidate at University College, London, working on English Catholicism in the Second World War. Broadly speaking, Josh's research interests lie at the intersection of war, religion, and nationalism. In particular, he is drawn towards social, cultural, and religious histories of warfare and how they are portrayed in collective memory. Joshua's current thesis, which is tentatively titled English Catholics in Second World War, Understanding the Social and Cultural Roles of Religion in Modern Warfare, seeks to understand how English Catholicism related to total war and adapted to the modernization and particularly the secularization of society. By using diocesan, national, and Vatican archive material, Joshua endeavors to incorporate a more holistic understanding of English Catholicism in the wider histories of Britain in the Second World War. Prior to attending UCL, Joshua earned an MA in the History of Warfare at the University of Birmingham and a BA in History at Regis University, Denver, Colorado. He currently resides in Reading, England, working as a student complaints officer for the University of Reading. So very welcome, Joshua, to your talk this evening. We're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate the introduction. And thank you as well to the English Catholic Historical Association for giving me this opportunity to speak, and also for giving me some grant funding as well that helped me pursue some of this research both in Birmingham and Liverpool last year. So before I begin, this project this presentation I'm giving today is a snapshot of my PhD research, and particularly three chapters within my thesis. So as I would like to say, these are ongoing thoughts and discussions that I'm working with to try to build and form into my thesis. So any kind of feedback or comments that you may have, I would greatly appreciate, as it would help me as I continue along. But without further ado, I can go and get started. In the summer of 1940, Mary Collins, a Catholic mother living in Chepstow, received a letter from her son Bill Collins, who had been serving in the RAF. Bill had informed Mary that his squadron had been busy fighting German advances over the air and was receiving support from the Polish army in exile as well. In one instance, Bill wrote that, quote, when the sirens went off and the men in the mess hall scrambled to their fighter planes to engage the enemy, in a chaotic moment, the Polish soldiers stood up, searched for their English-Polish dictionaries, and shouted, God pickle you gentlemen. Now, obviously, what they were trying to translate was something different, but what I thought was that this quote kind of adds a bit of an image to what we can think of what English Catholicism was doing in World War II. Pickling, as I would say, provides the basis in which I would like to situate this talk today. Although the phrase was meant to say, God preserve you, gentlemen, this metaphor elicits an image of Catholics in England what Catholics in England tried to do throughout the Second World War, which was to preserve a Catholic culture and faith within England and have it still stand come the outcome of war. And this sits as one of the base questions for me in my research, and that's to what extent did they succeed in preserving Catholic culture and faith in England? And to what extent was this helpful? But however, in addressing this question, what I hope to show today is that this aim that they tried to do was not as simple as it sounds. And so when looking at Catholic activity in England during the Second World War, it has some unique and novel insights into how religious communities understood and responded to wartime exigencies. It also provides important insights into how secularization and modernization affected religious institutions in the 20th century, and that between 1940 and 1944, Catholics in England became more dynamic in their approach to dealing with fast-changing environments that affected everyday Catholic life. The destruction brought about by bombing, conscription of men and women into the wartime economy, and evacuation of children from urban to rural areas of England changed the normal running of everyday life. Catholics were forced to interact and work alongside non-Catholics counterparts for the very survival of their island nation. And at the same time, discussions of Reconstruction and the imaginings of a post-war Britain also featured prominently in the minds of Catholics. And so by looking forward to a post-war world and adapting to a more rapid changes in society due to war, Catholics reconsidered the landscapes of British society and their place within it. So these reconsiderations took various forms that ranged from experimentation with ecumenism to doubling down on the protection for Catholic schools. And between these progressive and conservative responses to the exigencies of war, it became apparent that Catholics were negotiating a middle ground for living in British society. These examples of cooperation and concessions between Catholics and non-Catholics in England revealed that mid-20th century Catholicism in England not only adapted to, but in some cases worked with the modernization of society. And additionally, where Catholics fought back against change and reform also revealed how Catholics viewed secularization in this period. Whereas communism and socialism were politically viewed as the highest evil in society, secularism was the catalyst to those ideologies. By fighting to retain autonomy of Catholic schools and the reduction of Catholic interaction with non-Catholics, the hierarchy believed that secularization could be prevented through a strict adherence to ultramundane faith. By having frequent reception of the sacraments, adequate Catholic education, and appropriate social interaction of a Catholic variety, it was believed to be the salve for maintaining a strong Catholic faith that would not waver in the thrashes of a secularized society. But together, these two approaches to the home front in wartime Britain demonstrate how Catholics became more open to physical change on the home front, but so long as those changes were firmly rooted in the correct ideological principles that ensured a Christian lifestyle. So until recently, religious activity and let alone Catholic activity in the Second World War has been vastly under-researched in the historiographical fields. When we look at macro histories of Britain in the Second World War, they have largely neglected the role of the institutional churches and when they played in the development of events. So for example, looking at Daniel Todman, Britain's War, Alan Allport's Britain at Bay, and Richard Overy, who's written numerous volumes on the bombing war, or his recent one, Blood and Ruins. They've all looked and contributed novel insights into Britain's experience in the Second World War from social, political, economic, and to a certain degree religious perspectives, but they haven't really touched so much on as to what the religious fervor of civilians were at this time. More focused studies of the Second World War have attempted to integrate these religious perspectives, but have also not completely married them to the wider picture of wartime experience. So for example, as well, you can see with Dietmar Seuss in Death from the Skies, he did an important chapter that looked at transnational approaches of the Protestant church's responses to bombing from both German and British perspectives, and kind of teased out the theological differences between the two and what that meant for just war. Vanessa Chambers equally as well looked at more at faith on the ground level and how with the experiences of bombing there was a recourse to supernatural activity or religious belief by the laity in Britain. And A.J. Hoover similarly also looks at the political divides between the church and the state and how those leaders either supported or opposed the war. But overall, looking at that to see what the wider picture is, there's yet to be done. Religious histories of Britain, on the other hand, have largely neglected the close examination of the world wars to instead focus on addressing the pervading theory of secularization, which was originally coined by sociologists in the 1970s, that was to describe the process of society disregarding the importance or influence of religion as the world became more modern. Individuals such as Callum Brown, Keith Robinson, John Wolfe have really tackled this approach from perspectives of British history by looking at religion in Britain in longue durée, to really kind of understand how religion has stayed and permeated through the time of history, and that secularization theory really is a product of its period. But in terms of Catholic approaches to the Second World War, more research has focused either on the clergy and its role in England, or on Cardinal Arthur Hinsley, who was a significant figure during this time. So for example, James Haggerty's biography on Cardinal Hinsley does an excellent job at explaining the role that Hinsley played in the Second World War and up to his early death in 1943. But then we also have Thomas Maloney, and Chadwick, who really kind of look at the more transnational dimension of the Catholic Church and its role with the Vatican in negotiating political activity during the war period. My project, therefore, aims to integrate these historiographical fields to elicit a better understanding of the relationship between warfare and religion. And ultimately, this study will hope to show how war impacts the institutional churches and the living religious lives to instigate reform and change. But it will also explore how religion as well influenced the development and evolution of war over time. So moving forward with the rest of my presentation, I will look closely at Catholic activity in England between 1940 and 1944, and looking at these crucial years, both the period of military failure and destruction through aerial warfare, along with the change in military success in Northern Africa, which led later on to the famous D-Day invasion, which coupled with the attitudinal changes about post-war reconstruction. The paper will first explore how Catholic responses to bombing and evacuation, and consider how these experiences colored Catholic attitudes towards reform. It will then discuss how Catholics identified a pervading moral crisis that was present as a result of the experiences of bombing and evacuation. And we'll then discuss how they then approached social reform in the latter half of the war and engaged on a public level to negotiate economic and educational reforms that protect Catholic interests. So just as a bit of a background for those who aren't as familiar with the Second World War, I'm starting at the latter half of 1940 when the Blitz begins. But prior to this point, we've had about a year of activity in the war, where war was declared in September 1939. You then see the introduction of the phony war, the period where there was not as much engagement on the home front. It was more of a building up of the wartime economy. And then you have the fall of France in May 1940, the invasion by the German forces into Belgium, Holland, and France. And then eventually the evacuations of Dunkirk, which then leads into the battles of Britain and then the beginning of the Blitz. So that's just a bit of a context to see where we'll be going forward from. So looking first at the responses to bombing and evacuation, when the Blitz commenced in early autumn of 1940, much of these raids were concentrated first on London and slowly expanded to other major cities, towns, and ports. And when considering these immediate responses to bombing, they varied regionally. J. Lippold, for example, who was a Catholic from Barnes in London, frequently commented about the adaptability that citizens demonstrated as raids grew in frequency. Between the 8th and 10th of September 1940, when a particular devastating series of raids took place over London, Lippold wrote, "There were some terrific air raids during these 3 days. On Sunday, the sirens went at 12:30 p.m. as I was coming home from Mass. The raid lasted 50 minutes. Very little sleep again, but we seemed to be getting used to it, or doing without it, I should say." Lippold's comments about the air raids over London demonstrated the flexibility of the citizens he observed to the chaotic environment civilians had to deal with throughout the Blitz. In contrast, Mary Collins's response to the bombing of London was more impassioned compared to Liverpool. And as mentioned before, Mary Collins was living in Chepstow, which was a rural town in Wales outside of Bristol. When explaining to her children about the air raids and the work that the RAF was doing to protect their homeland, Collins wrote, "I told them about Bill, her son, who was going to bomb Germany, and said that for every bomb Jerry drops here, Bill will drop one over there." Collins's attitude toward German aggression and the home front was transferred to her students as well during this period, and this became evident on the 4th of September 1940, where she commented about a game that she played with her students while sitting through an air raid. In order to distract her students, Collins asked her students if they had one wish, what would it be? And she recalled, quote, "The very first wish I wish is that we could win the war. Another wish that Germans didn't have any bombs. And one ruthless lad wished that the Germans would all get killed." For both Collins and Lippold, their experiences towards the Blitz eventually merged into a common theme of desire for revenge or retaliation, where by the end of 1940, Lippold noted that the great destruction and overall desire to give to the Huns, quote, "thick and heavy," was becoming more prevalent, and he wished to be associated with this fervor. The initial contrast in these responses revealed a difference in experience towards the Blitz. And whereas Collins was forced to deal with the knock-on effects of modern warfare, which included the evacuations, the displacement of urban citizens into rural areas, and the general disruption of daily activities, Lippold, on the other hand, was faced with a more dangerous situation where seeking the necessities to survive was more important. Yet as these raids became more frequent and destructive, general themes of revenge became more prevalent throughout the rest of 1940. The Catholic news press also contributed to these ongoing discussions of the Blitz and tried to assert a more clear position as to how Catholics should respond to bombing. On the 13th of September 1940, the Catholic Herald published an article entitled Reprisals, which said, quote, "We repeat that we do not deny temptation, nor may we glibly condemn those who, provoked by savagery, by the signs of the injury inflicted on those dear to them, demand an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. It is for God alone to judge, and but the plain fact remains that elementary Christianity sternly demands resistance to this temptation." The editorial emphasized the importance of maintaining core Christian principles when responding to suffering. Although it was reasonable that individuals felt angry and frustrated at the destruction caused by the Blitz, it was not reasonable to return the same behavior. Other newspaper articles, such as what was published in the Universe, also tried to mitigate these Catholic responses to persistent bombing raids. And in one article entitled "Total War," the Universe was quoted for saying, "For a whole year, our minds have pictured this onslaught. Now that we have seen it, we now know it can be withstood." And so what the newspapers were trying to do at this time, we're trying to emphasize to the public that, yes, we've had this previous understanding and idea of what bombing would have been like, what destruction would have been like, based on the euphoria and the previous discussion that happened that we saw from the Spanish Civil War in the 30s and beforehand. But what we are seeing now is really that what can happen is it can be managed and we can move forward with it. So it's the idea of keep calm, carry on. And this is what the bishops tried to encourage to the faithful as well by embracing attitudes of forgiveness and fortitude in their Advent pastorals. Archbishop Williams of Birmingham, for example, reminded the faithful of his diocese that although they may be fighting for a just cause, they needed to remember that they were also sinners. And he wrote, "Let us not forget to pray for our enemies as our Lord prayed for his executioners." Williams reminded his flock about the common humanity they shared with their belligerents, even though the Germans had been inflicting a great deal of suffering upon the British home front. And Williams' message reminded Catholics that God had taught them not to look down or differently upon others despite their actions. Archbishop of Downey of Liverpool even stated that, quote, "We must rise above the ethic of the jungle and see that the hatred finds no place in our spiritual equipment." These were some of the examples of what the hierarchy was trying to pose as well to them, to kind of keep up the morale within the Catholics on the home front. And from what I can also show here on the images here is what you can see here, cuttings that I've taken out from the Universe that featured a bunch of images across London during the Blitz. Moving from one side to the other, I've arranged them looking at going from the west end of London to the east end of London. You can see that the level of destruction changes. So on the first one, you can see that's Our Lady of Victories, which was the proto-cathedral for Westminster until the current cathedral had been built, had been bombed and lost its roof. Another one was a parish in West End London where a couple still got married even amidst the rubble, and that was the headline of the time, was that we're still carrying on and having marriages even in bombed out churches. Below that was Farm Street Church, the Jesuit provincial headquarters in Mayfair, which lost its roof to a bombing raid. But then as you move closer to the east end, you start to see more parishes such as the one above there, which had a parish, a school, and a presbytery, which were all destroyed in the war. So there was nothing there for them to use or go to. And in the case of the one church on the left side from southeast London, it was a case that so long as it was structurally sound, they would host mass. But if it wasn't, they were having to find other cases by going to cinemas or other theaters to kind of make do. So similarly, evacuation experiences also proved a series of mixed responses within the Catholic communities. And most notably, these were the dispersal of working class Catholic children into rural regions of England that were not equipped to service the religious needs of Catholics. And so despite the efforts of the hierarchy and the Catholic Education Council in 1938 and 39 at organizing private school evacuations to ensure that Catholic children stayed together, many were sent across the country and widely dispersed in regions that proved difficult with organizing logistical processes to getting children to mass or school. For example, Mr. Callahan, a teacher at Sylvester Secondary Boys School in Liverpool, noted that when the evacuations took place on the 1st of September 1939, out of 1,800 pupils, about 700 enrolled for the evacuation, and of these 700, 300 were under the care of the teachers at our departments when we left. So that change just shows that even though in the logistics of moving everyone out, things were moving at different places, people were put into different trains or different transports. And so despite the efforts to try to keep them together, they were still dispersed. And that even though there was a tactical success in organizing this mass movement of people, almost 1.5 million at the beginning, of so many children over a weekend, it took a few weeks for things to settle down before the hierarchy and the clergy could really gain a clearer picture as to what the situation and the well-being of Catholic children were like in the countryside. And so following this mass exodus of civilians in the countryside, teachers and priests who were evacuated with the Catholic schools began to send updates to the bishops of their respective dioceses about their children in the regions. Letters that were sent to Monsignor Adamson, who was Archbishop Downey's secretary in Liverpool, were of mixed review. Sister Stanislaus, for example, who was evacuated to Colwyn Bay in Wales, reported that children were being well cared for, and that she mentioned that they had temporarily been placed in a furnished house with others scattered throughout the area in groups of 2 or 3. Despite most of the children being billeted with non-Catholics, Sister Stanislaus stated that on Sunday, quote, the church was packed to overflowing, and in a few cases, some local people helped to pay the children's fares. So despite this uniqueness of the situation, Sister Stanislaus demonstrated a case where, despite the irregularity of being in regions where Catholic facilities were not available for children, the local communities worked extraordinarily to kind of help make sure that they maintained and observed their religious obligations. And so even though Sister Stanislaus praised the hard work of these host families for accommodating the Catholic children and other communities did not have as similar of an experience. Other cases, for example, of Father Doyle, who wrote to Monsignor Adamson in September, stated that the boys of Holy Cross School were scattered over Anglesey in villages of 5 to 7 miles apart. The head teacher, informed me that it was impossible to procure buses to take the children to one place, as they do not run before 12, and the villages are so far apart that the task seems very difficult. John Mather, an assistant teacher for Holy Cross, also echoed similar sentiments in his letter to the Archbishop, where he raised serious concerns about not having the ability to attend Mass on Sundays. And despite there being churches relatively close to where the schools were evacuated, they were far enough away that their host began to complain that dinner was considerably delayed, quote unquote. By this, what we're saying is that we're starting to see now a friction that developed between both the Catholic culture communities and the nonconformist communities, where for trying to accommodate for Catholics to go to church in the mornings was then impeding on the fact that the nonconformists couldn't go to their services in the evenings. They would have to take care of the Catholic children when they returned in the afternoons. And so Mather also noted that even in addition to this, there was issues with weather, and that a lot of these boys returned soaked due to inadequate clothing and faced further physical illness. And this speaks to the social components of what happened during the evacuation, that as children were moved out, you started to see working class children moving in with middle and upper class families in the rural areas, and they were having to deal with the fact of lack of clothing, lack of resources. So there was sociocultural clashes going on here as well. But even though with all these going on, they were largely taken care of in the reception eras physically, and concerns over the ability to meet educational and religious needs eclipsed the generosity that was provided by non-Catholics. So much so that on the 27th of October, 1939, the Universe featured a main headline which said, "Evacuation, Catholic fears many children exposed to loss of faith in safe areas." And the correspondent emphasized in the feature article that, quote, "Schools are shut and the children, freed from the discipline, are roaming the streets. Many parents, having grown accustomed to having the religious instruction of their children left almost entirely to the teachers at their schools and in church, are now in a position to supply this deficiency." So the lack of facilities, of priests, the parental involvement, consequently, according to the Universe, meant that children were at a serious risk of losing their faith. And these problems emerged during this first evacuation, which set the precedent for Catholic discomfort towards future evacuations throughout the remainder of the Second World War. So by the time we reach the point where the Blitz was taking place and you have a second wave of evacuations taking place, the bishops had mixed views of support and opposition to this. One of them, most famously, was the Bishop Vincent Marshall of Salford, who commented privately in an ad clarem that it would be preferable for children to stay in their cities with their parents and face the dangers of being bombed over being evacuated and losing their faith. This opinion reflected the belief that if one died in a state of grace, they would be saved, and consequently risking the loss of faith for survival was much worse. And for example, the person on the left is an image of Bishop Vincent Marshall. Next to him is Bishop Joseph Thorman of Hexham and Newcastle, who had a vastly different opinion to the approach to evacuation. Thorman, on the other hand, had differed in that he emphasized Catholics could not oppose the policy of evacuation due to its necessity for avoiding, quote, greater evils. In a reflection that he gave to his priests, he praised the hard work that everyone, Catholic and non-Catholic, had done to make the first evacuation a success, and acknowledged that even though not perfect, Catholics could learn from the previous experience and be better prepared should a second evacuation take place. Thorman's perspective overall was concluded that the children have not only been free from intolerance or bigotry or interference, but have been positively assisted in their Catholic duties and practices. And so despite these differences of opinion, Thorman's perspective took the front seat for the hierarchy, and in its annual meeting in April 1940, they openly chose not to oppose future evacuations, but would seek suitable alternatives to ensure Catholic children would be kept together and that their educational needs and religious needs were met. This was so much so the case that in this period you also begin to see more examples of concessions or compromises taking place within Catholic communities. And in Staffordshire, for example, the local education authority attempted to merge Catholic and non-Catholic children together to send them to council schools for education. But this was due to the accommodation restriction of facilities that there were. The LEA was left with no choice but to merge these children. But when word was reached to the priests in Liverpool, it caused an uproar, so much so to the point to where Archbishop Downey had to request that a conference be held to figure out what kind of middle ground could take place. And on the 27th of November 1941, the director for education for Staffordshire and the clergy representing the Archdiocese of Liverpool met and ended up determining that what would be sufficient would be to allow the children to be together so long as the numbers were required, but Catholic teachers would come to give the religious education for Catholic students, and that would help maintain a Catholic identity. Otherwise, if there was the better chance to keep them separate, that would be the way forward. So maintaining a Catholic faith and identity was paramount to the Catholic clergy, and the introduction of wartime violence such as bombing posed significant issues with maintaining the status quo, preserving Catholic faith among the laity, where due to bombing you had the destruction of churches, facilities, presbyteries. There was no longer the ability for Catholics to attend their central services in their places. They were having to seek other places to go. In the same case with evacuation, being in new areas where either A, they were separated too far apart, or the facilities weren't there to make sure that one group was able to be kept together. There would be cases of merging or compromising taking place to help ensure that a Catholic identity could be preserved. But at the same time, while the clergy was certainly open to preserving the status quo of Catholic living, they also had to question whether these changes and what they were negotiating were affecting the moral fiber of their communities. And this leads into an idea that at the same time, there was a discussion of what the moral crisis was that was emerging as a result of the war. And amidst the immediate responses to the experience Catholics were having in relation to the bombing and evacuation, the clergy had been concerned whether these disruptions had any impact on Catholics retaining their faith. And so as early as 1939, the hierarchy had been investigating this problem, what was called leakage, which was a term to denote the loss of faith or the loss of practice amongst Catholics, and to try to understand what were the motives that were causing this. And so in 1940, Archbishop Downey requested that various members of the clergy and Catholic laity provide reflections on what they thought caused the problem of leakage. Some examples of that were B. Gill, a teacher in the Liverpool Archdiocese, claimed that the chief cause of leakage was due to the lack of faith in the home by placing the blame on parents. Gill stated that the, quote, indifferent example and, quote, apathetic supervision of the practice of religion by parents at home led to the bulk religious education being left to Catholic teachers to cover. So essentially what should have been done, that faith that starts in the home, was being outsourced to the schools because of their over-reliance on using Catholic schools. Father T.J. Rigby from St. Joseph's Deanery in Liverpool, as another example, thought that the main cause of leakage was due to A, slum property and overcrowding, B, the lack of religious education in schools, and C, the work of the bad influence of fellow colleagues. So Father Rigby's example kind of spread it out more, not so much as blaming on the parents, but also saying that there's an overall issue with society at the moment. And especially with looking at social concerns, that when the immediate social concerns aren't met, we're going to then lose off other important aspects such as religion. So based on these reports that were coming back, in February 1941, the Executive Board for the Catholic Action in Liverpool agreed to form a subcommittee to conduct inspections of the society around them, which also included air raid shelters, to determine whether or not the overall conditions, social conditions and living conditions were, and established what assistance could be done to help prevent any further leakage. The committee determined that when looking at air raid shelters specifically, certain shelters were in good condition. Many were, quote, to be distressing due to various factors such as lack of heating, water, sleeping accommodations, ventilation, etc. And aside from these physical conditions of the shelters, the subcommittee separately noted that, quote, dangers exist owing to undesirable people using shelters for unlawful purposes, especially where lighting is bad. Also, at air raid times, the shelters fill up with all kinds of people, and the regular frequenters, quote, who are respectable people, are inconvenienced by the rowdyism and bad example. So interestingly, this committee, when they separated out the two comments about the physical conditions and then the quality of the people in the shelters, they distinguished this type of individuals using the shelter by their morality. And the morals of those in the shelters that formed a section of Catholic Action inspectors were asked to comment on, they asked inspectors to comment on them specifically. So, for example, St. George's Hall shelter was noted that there was plenty of flirting that occurred within an air raid times, and that there were complaints of loose women going through the facility. Another example is at the exchange station, it was noted that women complained that men of the, quote, tramp classes came in at about 3 a.m. and made themselves objectionable when lights were out. And at Trinity Church basement at St. Anne Street, the inspector stated that the morals of the individuals were not too good, citing the lack of supervision in higher level couples who were mostly 18 years old. So these reports revealed to the bishops and the Catholic Action that the living environment and the situations in which Catholics were having to navigate through during this war period by being in and out of shelters in housing conditions were providing situations for Catholics to fall more easily into temptation and not have as strong a moral resilience than what was before, or what was perceived to be before. At the same time with this, workplace conditions also presented significant concerns for the hierarchy in trying to inculcate a Christian fervor amongst the population. This was especially apparent in early 1941 when the government introduced the conscription of women into the workforce. And at the start of 1941, the British government made it necessary for all women aged 18 to 64 to register for war work. Bishop Matthews, who was the auxiliary bishop to Westminster, noted in a letter to Archbishop Downey on the 16th of February 1941 that, quote, all women beginning with certain age groups and then unmarried are to register, and their cases are to be considered by the managers of the employment exchanges and the Ministry of Labor officials. This was to include all women, including religious and those who were in convents. And so Matthew had emphasized that, needed to emphasize that no exceptions were being made, and that meant women religious would be required to enter the workforce as well. And so given the previous reports about workplace conditions and their contributions to the problem of leakage, Matthew was concerned about introducing women into this environment, which could negatively affect this problem. The emphasis of, quote, unmarried women entering the workforce without proper supervision or support from employers could further exacerbate the concerns over promiscuity. And Matthews and Downey were both keen to work with also Archbishop Amigo Southwark to push back and receive further assurance from the government that they would consider appropriate allocations of employment for women, especially for the religious. And as a side as well, the Catholic community, the Catholic Action communities also began to jump up at this time to see how they could help provide more Catholic-related resources to people in the workforce. And on the 1st of March, 1941, the Catholic Action issued a little memorandum there called Catholic Action in Wartime, which they produced over 2,000 copies of this report and dispersed them across the country, which tried to establish the point of what Catholic action is and what they can do to provide services for people. And on the broad side, what they tried to do was they tried to produce cards and other spiritual materials to help improve family prayer and improve the sanctification of the home. And they published pamphlets for circulation about the dangers of mixed marriage. And the reports of over 500 copies were sold to lay Catholics. But in regard to wider society, Catholic Action worked with its affiliate Catholic organizations and societies to promote what was called corporate prayer by providing spaces for prayer in the individual headquarters of factories and facilities, and they arranged for days of exposition of Blessed Sacrament to help present a more Catholic identity within the workforce. And so this emphasized the social service division of Catholic Action and their continued efforts to provide this advice, rehousing of bomb victims, and other assistance to help those who were suffering from the exigencies of the Blitz and the evacuation. But all this together also shows how in the changeover there is this base point of a moral crisis that they're trying to approach. And this is what begins to color their approach to economic and educational reforms. And so one of the most interesting ones that I found so far was an example of ecumenism that happened in early 1941. And this was an immediate result from the Blitz, where the hierarchy tried to prevent the exacerbation of the larger moral and secular issues going on. Archbishop or Cardinal Arthur Hinsley at the time decided to publish a joint letter with both the Anglican bishop and the Free Church president in the Times in December of 1940, which called for the re-Christianization of society and the need to find a Christian way forward. And so this letter backed itself up based on Pope Pius XII's 5 peace points about how they could achieve a just peace in this war, and built on this idea that without a Christian society, we would not have a lasting peace. And so through this, Hinsley had directed his wartime society, which was called the Sword of the Spirit, to establish Catholic support for this and to see what a Christian or a Catholic way forward would be. And this was all to be also done with implementing the 50th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which was the Catholic encyclical written by Pope Leo XIII to discuss what Catholic action was in social settings and in the work environment. And so, in a way to honor that, the Sword of the Spirit decided that in May they would host a joint lecture at the Stoll Theatre. And this lecture was to then bring together Christian leaders from across Britain to discuss what they could do in terms of supporting the war and how they can then also look at reconstructing Britain for a post-war future. And overall, these Stoll lectures emphasized, they were heralded as a great success through the news media. They were emphasized the need for joint cooperation by both Catholics and non-Catholics. The address by both Cardinal Hinsley and the Archbishop of Canterbury emphasized the importance of working together to defend the basic right to living a Christian life, which according to their perspective was being removed from the society under Nazi control. Looking beyond these confessional and theological divides, the Stoll lectures elicited more general concerns about the basic Christian values in society and the rise of secularization. So there was this further call to work together. And the Catholic press advertised that this was an overarching success. It was unprecedented an unprecedented all-Christian rally, and it generated so much interest that individuals had to, quote, be turned away at the door due to the overfill that happened on the day. The tablet reflected in an article that these lectures were the outward affirmation that the quote, the world of today, all Christians must join together in defense of certain basic principles. And so whilst some individuals were very supportive of this endeavor, others tended to be a bit more reserved, especially when it came to looking at the cooperation that would take place between Catholics and non-Catholics. And this really came into a wider debate later on in the war between mostly the bishops, where the discussion was allowing Catholics to be able to be in the same room to work ecumenically with non-Catholics, because they would violate a core tenet of faith that non-Catholics were not considered to be a part of the true faith, and that it would violate an aspect of prayer. And so ultimately, because of the discussions that had place between this and the theological debates with it, the Stoll lectures were a failed attempt at ecumenism, but it was a first attempt at it. And so the society ended up breaking down into two separate groups, where you had the Sword of the Spirit and the Religion and National Life, which was the vein that would run the Anglican Church and the Free Churches. And the two would work together to produce joint statements, but they wouldn't be as a cooperative force. But through that group, what it ended up trying to do, especially with looking at this idea of what the Catholic Herald mentioned in the 3rd of January, was they were working to end this moral blackout. And what they were thinking, what they were playfully playing out, as the idea that the moral insecurities of what were going on in the war, of leakage, of promiscuity that was going on, they were trying to bring an end to this point. But then when as time carried forward, and we start to look into the latter half of the war, we start to see that the rest of British society also starts to begin discussing what post-war reconstruction would look like. And amidst many of these looks, that we had what was called the Beverage Report, which was commissioned by Sir William Beveridge by the government to look at what they could do to revamp the economic life of Britons in the country. This report, which was published in 1942, was originally entitled the Social Insurance and Allied Services Act. It was a report that was supposed to be the remedy for social inequality, and sought to attack what Beveridge thought was the 5 giants of idleness, ignorance, disease, squalor, and want. And he developed what was going to be a cradle-to-grave social program that called for the free national health and social insurance. Now, in terms of when this began, Catholics had already, as I was showing before, had been engaging with these discussions of what society needed to be in a post-war world, that we needed to fight for these Christian values and this Christian way forward. When the attempt at doing it through a joint collaborative effort to the churches failed, the Catholic Church then looked at, and the bishops then looked at working through the reports and the government's actions. And so in response to the Beverage Report, the hierarchy, or discussions of what was going to be the Beverage Report, the hierarchy produced a joint pastoral letter in June 1942, which was their response to what the Beverage Report would need to include. And so to give just a quote from this pastoral, the bishops wrote that, as Christians, we ought not to tolerate any attack, direct or indirect, on the dignity of man or on the sanctity of family life. The dignity of man is attacked every time a man is thrown into unemployment without any fault of his own, or when he has to sell his labor for less than a just wage. Family life is attacked by divorce, which breaks up the sacredness of the marriage tie. Family life and the life of society are sapped by the practice of contraception, which frustrates the primary objects of wedded life and sets up the pleasure arising from the sex act as the aim and object of the act itself. So overarchingly, in this pastoral letter, the bishops focused on any kind of social reform needs to be rooted and focused on in the family. If there's going to be any reform, it needs to look at how it will affect the family as a unit and not the individual citizen. And so by situating the family and its needs at the core of these reform discussions, the bishops outlined 10 minimum requirements that they would need to see in a post-war society. And I know there's a lot of quotes up there, but I just wanted to show so you could see an idea of what it was that they were pitching. And interestingly enough, the ones that aren't highlighted were similar claims that both, not only for them, but the British Communist Party or the Socialist parties were calling for similar types of reforms, looking at a living wage that's sufficient and moderately comfortable for life savings, the ability to have wages that were agreed by a standard of work, and if the work couldn't provide for it, the state would then provide for it. To have living facilities that would be so that way no one person had to sleep in the living room. But then at the same time, you can see what I highlighted in yellow were the more conservative aspects, so the parts where Catholics were trying to preserve a Catholic culture or a Catholic way forward in this reform. And so those where you could see that when they were talking about wage support, it needed to be that wives should not be obliged to go to work to make up the differences. So in a sense, to get rid of the conscription that was taking place during the war, to ban the manufacture and sale of contraceptives, which were widely in use at this time in terms of the military, and the ban and manufacture of obscene books, and to ensure that religious education was to meet the wishes of the parents, and that there would basically be a Catholic education throughout all of this. In terms of that, looking at that Beverage Report, that showed for us that Catholics were really open to the idea of change. They were looking at social change, and they saw that the base needs need to be met before we could then look at the wider spiritual needs. And so they were open to these discussions, but it had to be rooted in a good way, in a good principle or a good Christian principle. But when it came to education reform, there was a different story. And so between this period, between 42 and 44, the government also opened up discussions about education reform as a means to mitigate the rise of juvenile delinquency that was taking place and to produce a more ready population who can contribute to post-war reconstruction. R.A. Butler, who was appointed by the government to look into this, was the director of education, was the president for the Board of Education at the time. And he pioneered this new way forward for education that outlined plans for a post-war secondary education that would give education for all children up to the age of 16. And it was supposed to be free for all pupils. Much of the power he was giving it down to the local education authorities to be able to set up and establish this, because it would completely revamp a lot of the way that the school systems were working previously. And so amidst these groundbreaking reforms that Butler tried to provide for free education to children until the age of 16, this required a reorganization and consolidation of the education system. And consequently, the ability to provide equal measures to denominational schools began to prove difficult. And so in a private meeting amongst the hierarchy, Cardinal Hinsley had agreed that there should be a minimum requirement that the church would accept for the government in the bill to protect Catholic schools and their interests. And that minimum requirement that was accepted was that if it was that the government couldn't provide financial support to help rebuild schools, then they would opt for having what was called the dual system in Scotland, which was the idea that the government would take over the schools, they would manage them and pay for them, but then the church would have the authority to say who was appointed as teachers and who could run the curriculum or set the religious syllabus for it. Ultimately, the Scottish model wasn't really accepted within Butler's plan, and the following options were then given instead, which was to either relinquish control of the schools to the government and have a say in an agreed religious syllabus, which would be shared by all the denominations, or receive a 50% grant money that would rebuild and maintain the schools, but they would have then control over the appointment of teachers. And so it was either not have to pay to rebuild schools or get half money support. So ultimately, this really kind of led into a campaign for fighting for Catholic schools, and that in a back and forth between the two, it really kind of turned into where the hierarchy started questioning the government and in terms of in terms of the Catholic's loyalty to the nation. The attack to say that we would only give you 50% support really kind of focused on to where this idea that if we've been loyal to the nation this whole time, we've been fighting, giving all 100% into the war, and now we're not getting an equal measure back. So much so that in a private letter that Hinsley wrote to R.A. Butler, he said, "We are as patriotic as any other Britisher, and for that very reason, we are determined to combat any educational scheme which might tend to jockey us out of the national system by endowing any other religious body at the expense of general community." And so from this, I've kind of put up a few kind of quotes just to see what other people and what other bishops were saying at this time. And that the highlighted sections there really kind of demonstrate how this turn kind of really goes back into this question of Catholic loyalty to the nation and what that would be. And so amidst these Advent pastorals that came out that were pushing for this for Catholic support to having greater equality in this within this reform system, Archbishop Downey led a campaign that was also encouraged by priests and lay Catholics to petition and campaign the local MPs to oppose the bills. And some of these petitions, you can see from there that the quotes that were raised, that the Catholic laymen were really interested in desirous of having Catholic schools in this new system. So much so to the point to where Patricia Culvert talks about how not having these schools could see that we're fighting for our Catholic lives, that Catholic livelihood would be destroyed if the schools were gone. Cuthbert Cromwell also kind of mentions that, amidst these discussions, if the worst has come to pass, they're ready to go on strikes. So they were ready to amass mass strikes at this time. And then even for Pitham, who said, I don't even feel that we are losing ground because there's no real authoritative pronunciation as to how we should be fighting. They were trying to seek this way forward. What were the bishops trying to give them? But there wasn't much guidance that the bishops gave back. They just said, write to your MPs. And so some of them started getting a bit confused as to what to do. And so, unfortunately, the lack of coordination and direction that the bishops gave to the laity proved difficult in organizing these consistent battlefronts for the schools. And so that's where J.G. Pitham's comment kind of comes into play. But ultimately, in the end of it, what the outcomes came to see from the Beverage and Education Acts was that there were little changes made in terms of it. Catholics were given a bit more assistance by either getting grants to rebuild schools early on through private loans that they could have, but then it would also be at the 50% level for the remaining. And that was kind of a way to help alleviate the exigencies of war, which was supposed to also be wrapped into the War Damages Act that was helping to rebuild churches and other and convents and monasteries during this period. But ultimately, what it kind of came to be was it was a failed attempt. And one of the images I have right there is of, in the Catholic Herald, they pictured R.A. Rab Butler as the Pope of Whitehall, who had full control over the free education, religious education, and the local authority. It's a bit blurry, but you can see the three tiers on the tiara that he had. But really, in all this, what is it trying to show for me, or for what I'm trying to elicit out of this, is that James Chappell recently wrote a book entitled Catholic Modern. And in his book, Chappell argued that Catholicism in the 20th century was not stagnant towards the modernization of society. Rather, many Catholic leaders and intellectuals engaged in creative ways to create a Catholic form of modernism that would suit Catholic interests in an evolving world. Chappell also reconsidered the political makeup of global Catholicism at this time and deduced that throughout the 20th century, Catholics were divided into two distinct camps, that being paternal and fraternal Catholicisms. Each one espoused certain social values about how Catholic faith can be maintained and preserved. Paternal Catholicism looking at a more conservative aspect of, the family unit, the husband being the one that works while the wife stays at home, having large families. Whereas fraternal Catholicism really kind of took a more social approach to it. It was about the individual, about developing more personalized understandings of Catholicism. And consequently, through Chappell's work, he's revealed that, there was an internal battleground in which Catholics negotiated this best platform for pushing a Catholic modern agenda. And he certainly presented novel concepts to understanding Catholicism in the 20th century, and has provided a creative yet stimulating way for rethinking Catholic activity in this period. However, based upon the material that I presented today, and looking at Catholics in England, they were not so clear-cut. It is not possible to divide Catholics into distinct liberal or conservative factions, northern or southern factions, or even urban versus liberal divides. The exigencies of the war forced Catholic communities in England to become more dynamic and engage with wider British society in ways that were inconceivable prior to the outbreak of war. The activity of the bishops and the laity at navigating each obstacle and seeking to compromise and make concessions, reveal how religious communities adopted to a modernizing and even secularizing state, while also maintaining a core identity of principles. And when the status quo was altered due to bombing or other exigencies, the integration of Catholic children into schools, or looking at different ways of facilitating sacraments, they had to seek different ways, and they had to work around these obstacles with it. So it kind of evolved and ebbed and flowed as it went. And so thus, by the end of 1944, the British government had begun these extensive overhauls of what post-war Britain would look like. And Catholics certainly had contributed to this discussion and placed their opinion and principles on the table for discussion, which thereby allowed them to participate in the reimaginings of a future society, but holding to the traditions of a faith. So in that regard, it was more of that dynamic look to it, not so much of a pitted one versus the other. But for that, that's what I have, and I'm open to any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. That was was excellent, very interesting. Would participants like to put questions into the chat box? You'll see that probably at the bottom of your screen. It could be at the top. And then Joshua could see those. So I'll give you time to do that if you'd like. There's a number of interesting points that you've made, Joshua. Interestingly, the number of practicing Catholics in this country was at its height at that time and declined only after about 1960. So, you know, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were the sort of height of English Catholic involvement in the sacraments and practice. And I say it's far, far less now, even with sort of today's society, communications and transport and things. The numbers of practicing Catholics has gone down hugely, and the population, of course, is much greater now, far greater than it was in 1940. Plus, we've also had a lot of people from immigrants and so on, ethnic minority people from abroad who brought Catholicism with them as well. So, all things considered, it's quite an alarming picture, really, in some ways today with Catholicism. But anyway, Catholic attitudes to war, I suppose, was rather mixed. Nazism was seen as a dangerous evil, so I suppose we were okay to fight them. I presume that was the case.
Yeah. So essentially, that forms a lot of my initial parts of this research, is looking at how they addressed warfare in this regard. And one of the interesting things, I didn't get to forgot to include it, was that at the beginning, the Catholic Church was very easy to kind of justify the war because it was this idea of fighting for Christian civilization, which was one of the famous quotes that Churchill used. They were able to back this up because the idea that when we're looking at the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany at the same time, these were considered, in a way, the two greatest evils. It was, you had godless communism and secular socialism, or not national socialism, and the two were really kind of set together, and it made the perfect pitch to say, this is why we're fighting this war. We're doing a Christian crusade. But when Operation Barbarossa took place in 1941, and the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the balance of power, or the balance of alliances changed, and Russia it actually came over to the Allied side. And during that period in late 1941, there was a fervor of news press coverage that was trying to change public opinion about the Soviet Union, about how now they are friends, they're fighting the same cause that we're doing, and it forced Catholics to kind of have to reconsider what their purposes were for fighting in this war. It kind of changed it from being a clear-cut nationalist divide or nation-state divide, to now we're dropping down to a lower level of, we're fighting for the re-Christianization of society, or the trying to remake society religious again.
Interesting. The idea of revenge must have been crossed a lot of people's minds. You know, you bomb our cities, we bomb your cities, sort of thing. I'm not sure how that affected Catholics and the role of forgiveness as well. Certainly by the end of the war, I think dropping the bomb on Hiroshima certainly caused Leonard Cheshire some problems and led to him setting up homes for people. Forgiveness must have also been forefront of many Catholics' minds at the end of the war. How you sort of get over it. So that's kind of an interesting idea as well.
Yeah, and that's a dynamic I'm actually looking at. So these three kind of situate the middle section of my thesis. The latter half I'm going to be looking at, and I haven't had a chance to really delve into depth deeply, but it's looking at that aspect of reconstruction and seeing
Yes.
how did they reconcile them? How did Catholics reconcile themselves with continental Catholics at this time? Famously,
Yeah,
there
they
was
were
at the
fighting
end of
back
the
in
war,
many cases.
the German or the English the Catholic Bishop of Nottingham was invited to go to Germany to reconcile with the Catholic conference there, and there was a big fervor about that, even to a point where I think it was Cardinal Frings came back to England and gave a sermon at Westminster Cathedral. So there's dynamics there in terms of how forgiveness worked and how whether or not it was just forgive and forget, or if there was a lot more of a trying to break old vengeances or things like that. But that's something I would definitely be looking into.
Another thing I thought about was ecumenism, because at that time the Catholic Church had the attitude that you couldn't enter a Protestant church. You certainly couldn't pray with Protestants. So that must have caused a few problems or worries for people. Should I go to a service? Should I go to a funeral in a Protestant church and all that sort of thing? As for Catholics and Protestants praying together, well, that was just pretty much unheard of, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Catholic prayer and religious life was very insular at this period. It was very much you go to the Catholic churches by going to another service, you are acknowledging the legitimacy of that faith was the thought of the time. And interestingly, what I've been finding in a lot of the diaries that I read or the material that I'm pulling that's from the laity is you see these instances where a lot of Catholics sit there and go, well, my friend's Baptist and they're getting married. I want to go see their wedding, so I'm just going to go see it. And they're just blatantly disregarding what the priests or the clergy or the bishops would be saying at this time. But to a certain degree, is wondering how much the laity are following through and they're starting to do more of this, because you get notions from like Cardinal Hinsley who are pushing this more proto-ecumenical agenda. This idea that maybe we can't pray and be in the same service together, but we can certainly work together. We can certainly, try to achieve more social goals across the board in terms of re-Christianizing Britain or trying to, put a stamp on what the proper principles of what British society would be in a post-war life. Ultimately, it kind of gets into a bit of some rows between him and the other bishops, most notably those in the north, where especially Archbishop Downey, who comes from a staunch Irish Catholic background and who's also dealing with a large Irish Catholic population, is very concerned about what the bishops in Ireland are doing and what they think of what's going on over here. And if it's that they're moving too much, that they're starting to err too much on the side of we're breaking canon law, or we're going to start to challenge theological principles. Archbishop Downey was very much keen to keep the status quo and say, no, we're this is the way we're supposed to do it. We're not supposed to, engage in this kind of way. But it adds to this larger discussion of just where the bishops and certain Catholic intellectuals are thinking, is there a loss of faith going on because we're letting them, because lay Catholics are going around and seeing other services or engaging with other people? Or is it that, they're maintaining the faith as was kind of determined with the children that were evacuated, that despite they were not going to, Sunday Mass every Sunday, or they were in Catholic schools, they were still noting how their faith was still pretty vibrant during this period, and they were still maintaining a pretty strong Catholic identity.
I think the overwhelming emotion I get is fear from those days. They were fearful. If you set foot in a Protestant church, something terrible would happen to you. Like they put a spell on you almost or something. It was a very strange idea. I mean, today it's completely different. I mean, it's a different world. Catholicism has moved on, 1,000 miles from that. But another thing I thought of is that how were prisoners of war cared for? Because there were Italian prisoners of war in a camp about 3 miles from where I am now, where I live, and they must have been catered for. They must have had to I suppose a priest must have visited. They wouldn't have been allowed to wander off to a nearest Catholic church, I wouldn't have thought, which would have been a few miles away anyway. But presumably a priest must have visited. But interestingly, the Vatican sent things to British prisoners of war in Germany. I have somebody gave me a number of years ago a sort of a diary which also had Christmas carols in it. Actually, was sent from the Vatican via the Red Cross to English prisoners of war in Germany. I've got one, and it's got notes in it by an English soldier about what was happening there and so on, about German planes coming over and having to peel thousands of spuds and so on. So I mean, at least the Vatican was trying to help there, I suppose.
And I've done some preliminary research at the Vatican already, and that was one of the big things I've seen through the materials there with the Commissione Soccorsi, which was the whole group that Pius XII had commissioned, and Pius XI or Benedict XV had started to support POWs in war. One of the big things that they were very much concerned about, and they would liaise through the Vatican liaised significantly through Archbishop Godfrey, the apostolic delegate to Britain, was whether or not the German and Italian POWs were being adequately taken care of. There was numerous reports going back to make sure that there was a big camp on the Isle of Man, in which what the agreement had been made between Godfrey and Downey was that they would send 3 priests at a time. They would get special passes, and they would ferry across the Isle of Man to then give masses or hear confessions or provide any kind of sacraments that were needed at the time, and then would come back. Sometimes there was the case that you would find that there was chaplains within that were captured and taken with them. They were given faculties to practice the sacraments in the camps. But you do see, as you were kind of mentioning, that these examples of where the Pope himself kind of granted, I think it was around like £10,000 to POWs to buy them rosaries and little prayer books that they could have in their camps. But that was a large humanitarian effort that the Vatican tried to engage with.
Can we have a look at the questions in the chat box if you want to respond to any of those? I think you can probably see them.
Yeah, let's see. Chris Batten has asked, concerning the internal differences and disagreements amongst communities and clergymen you mentioned, could you speak a little more about the how and if the different groups or ways of thinking approaches codified name themselves or turn into sorry, I think so. If I'm understanding that correctly, it's how these discussions kind of formed into formal organizations or groups within the church. Is that correct? Is Chris able to speak at all, or?
He'd have to be unmuted, I think.
I see. I would say that essentially there was a lot of these groups, and in Catholic society, especially during this time, it was formed around organizations, and that was kind of the main mouthpiece, as it were, that kind of allowed Catholic social life and public life to kind of flourish. Tom Buchanan has written on this before about how a sense of political Catholicism was shown through the social guilds and organizations that were present in England. And so a lot of cases that you see is that when certain individuals get together and they start discussing ideas, it starts to form the basis of an organization that they start, and then it eventually gets adopted through Catholic action. The case of the Sword of the Spirit is the most pertinent, where Cardinal Hinsley at the time, when the Italians entered the war, there was a big discussion of Catholic loyalty and whether or not Catholics in England were, going to remain loyal to the British Crown or if it was to the Pope. And there was a lot of misunderstandings as to what the status of the Pope and the Vatican was when the Italians entered the war. But to kind of stymie that, Cardinal Hinsley gathered together a couple of intellectuals, which were Christopher Dawson, who was the notable historian at the time and editor of the Tablet, and ACF Beals and Barbara Ward, to kind of coalesce together and create the society that would then help promote English Catholics' participation in the war effort. And it really kind of became this political mouthpiece to say, like, this is how we're going to direct the war and how Catholics are going to see the war go forward. I'm not so sure if that's the answer to the question, but feel free to add any addendums, then I'd be happy to talk about it. Another one was asked in terms of what happened with regard to the conscription of women religious. Yes, so at the end of that, within those discussions, there was a big worry that all of a sudden religious women were going to be conscripted in. After some discussions that were had between the Ministry of Labor and the hierarchy, they were able to broker the deal that they would be registered, they would be on the roster should it ever happen, but then for the time being, those who were in convents or monasteries would be precluded from wartime activity. But it was mainly just to get everyone on a roster. It never went to the full point of taking on the religious. One from Evie and Jimmy. On the question of Catholic loyalty in England, was there ever a suggestion of doubt from other members of society? And could you draw a link from the forced modernization of the Catholic Church at this time and Vatican II? Yeah, so, okay, in terms of Catholic loyalty, yes, there was definitely some skepticism that went on between non-Catholics and Catholics at the time. There could be an argument to be said that it might be a lot of Catholics being in their heads about fear about disloyalty, but there is a lot to be said about how with the neutrality of Ireland and the Italian entry into war, there was these fears of fifth column Catholicism or fifth column spying that would take place. And so there was a sense of querying whether or not Catholics were loyal to the national cause. And that's kind of why you have the push for the Sword of the Spirit from Cardinal Hensley's group. You have these kind of proto-movements towards these ecumenical activities to show, yes, we are Catholic, but we are also English, we are also British, and we can participate in this war at the same time. We're fighting for the same things that you're fighting as well. And to a large degree, that's what you see in that change of attitude in 1941, when they start talking about we're here to re-Christianize Britain and society. The change turns from saying we're focusing on Europe to now we're focusing on Britain. And it becomes an internal project for them. And so that really kind of highlights it again when they start having the education discussions and they go, well, wait, we've been helping out this whole time. We've devoted all our efforts and things to this, and we've compromised along the way. We've allowed, the ability for the War Damages Act to, take on limited repairs to rebuild churches. We've accepted the evacuations. We didn't outwardly grumble about these. But now all of a sudden when we're rebuilding the schools, you're telling us you can only give us 50% help. That's not fair, considering that other denominations and that being from public schools, you would have the CV getting more support. So there was these questions of loyalty going on, and Catholics were to a certain degree trying to demonstrate and prove that loyalty. In terms of the forced modernization of the Catholic Church at this time, it really kind of predates before Vatican II. I mean, these discussions of modernity and modernism are really kind of dating back to almost Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum. They're looking at industrialized society and how are we engaging with this and what do we need to do with this. And so to a certain level, what I would say is that prior to the war, Catholics kind of had this idea of we have this set plan. It was written in Rerum Novarum. It's written in our principles as Catholics that this is how we interact in society and this is the best way forward. But then when the war got introduced and you started having these difficulties with trying to meet the status quo, they had to start renegotiating these points. And so that's where, in a sense, that they're having this negotiation with modernization. And really Vatican II kind of takes that to the next level. So arguably, I would say is that, looking for my project now, there would be a good project to say, how then do we move from World War II to Vatican II? Because I think at the moment, a lot of the history really jumps from restoration of the church in 1850, the end of the penal laws, and then Vatican II, and then everything in between just happens to get missed. But that is really the period in which they're discussing modernization.
Just one last question from me anyway. Do you think Rerum Novarum, which was published in 1891, did have an influence on sort of social sort of feeling about change in society? There was certainly during the war, I know, having talked to people who lived through it, a feeling that there needed to be more equality, there needed to be free education, there needs to be free healthcare. So set up the welfare state, the NHS, and so on, which happened immediately after the war. was Catholic social teaching involved in that, or influential?
Yeah, I would definitely say to a certain degree that was that was the foundation point to which Catholics were able to engage in this reform setting, and that's where in 1941, when they had the 50th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, they kind of make a big deal about discussing it. Catholic action groups engage in they engage in a lot of focused discussions. Academic groups get together to talk about what does Rerum Novarum mean, how can we look at this in society today, especially in a Britain moving forward. And so that really kind of sits as that foundation piece. That one, and also with Quadrasimo Anno, kind of sits as another foundation piece for them. There is a certain discussion as to whether or not that was the way forward, because there was also certain pockets of Catholics that thought, well, we need to kind of abandon all this altogether and just kind of go back to pre-1789. And that was kind of some discussion, some arguments that were made about we need to move back. But arguably, that the idea is that a lot of Catholics said that we had these encyclicals pre 20th century. They were in a way addressing and countering what was the developments of Marxism at the time, or even the developments into what would eventually become communism. So they kind of had this proto idea of equality and equal share for all. And one of the interesting things, I was talking with a colleague just the other day at Reading, and I was telling him about my project, and he goes, "Oh, he's like, I know I think it was, he said his grandfather was quoted for saying, I'm the first Catholic communist." And he's like, everyone would just jump and go, "Wait, how can you do that?" And he goes, "Well, it's quite simple." He's like, we have, we treat all of us equally. We have all these principles. We just have the God component." And then that was the add-all to it. But it was a bit of a funny joke, but it kind of sits to say like that they were bringing these ideas forward, but it was just that linchpin turned into where's the religion, where is God in the discussion.
I can't help thinking, comparing sort of English Catholic sort of social experience, sort of late 1940s, the welfare state, NHS and so on, compared with sort of right-wing American Catholics who even today go, "Oh, that sounds like socialism." Healthcare shouldn't be free; it should be insurance. So Catholics in different parts of the world have different attitudes towards these things. I would imagine, even now, from what I've heard, anyway.
Yes, and that's why I was a large part of my argument is saying that the war really kind of brought about this more progressive form of Catholicism in England. This idea that we can have more equal opportunities and free education and pay for this. These were things that in the U.S. model, for example, just never became a thing. Separation of church and state made it completely clear that if you're going to have a religious education, you're paying for it. And that was the way it was always pushed forward. But here, it's always had this dynamic of running with it. And when the war broke out, because now the state had sold this idea that you are sacrificing yourself for the good of the war and for the good of society. Sonia Rose, who wrote a lot on this aspect of understanding British identity in the war, was this idea of equality of sacrifice, and this is what the government had to sell to their people, to the civilians, that you're sacrificing for the war and for the greater good of your home and your state. But then it turned into, okay, well, now we have to give you something for that, and that's what a large discussion that led into social reform was, that to keep public morale up, it was, you're fighting this war, and when you come home, we will take care of you. The state will take care of you. And for that, into that regard, the church really it was in a very contingent place to actually have these discussions, especially when the tide of the war started changing and the discussion of victory became more of a feasible objective. So Catholics in England really kind of had this unique opportunity to really really engage and talk about what a Christian society should look like. And so that's really kind of that way of why I'm saying that in this way for Catholics in England, there was this dynamic way. They kind of saw an opportunity and they moved with it, and they ebbed and flowed with it. And to a certain degree, that meant having to reconsider and think about, okay, does that mean, Catholic children can be with non-Catholic children in schools? Does that mean, some women, wives and husbands could both work at the same time? What were the lines that we're not going to cross? and what were the lines that we're willing to have discussion with, which to what I can say is I haven't seen so much in like an American model, or I don't know the German or Italian models as well, but I can imagine not as much.
I'd say that European Catholicism has a lot of differences with the American Catholic experience, probably for lots of reasons. I think there's one more comment in the box there, Joshua.
Yeah, it looks like my parents are both from John and Lindsay Mulaney were both at Bletchley Park, where her mother became Catholic and joined the Grail group after the war, and belonged to the Sword of the Spirit. Oh, that's fantastic! Yeah, I mean they were both really big groups. The Grail and the Sword of the Spirit were massive organizations at this period of time. Between them, the Catholic Truth Society, and the Catholic Social Guild. Those were kind of like the big ones of Catholic action. And the Sword of the Spirit, interestingly, it did die off after the war, and it became the I think it was called Catholic International, or it was something like that. But it kind of turned into more a peace movement. But I haven't had a chance to go back and see because now that I figured out when they shifted and they changed names, their archive is in Westminster, and I need to go back and have a look at them. But hopefully there might be more stuff that talks about the genesis of Sword of the Spirit and how it then evolved into the other movement.
Are there any more questions at all? Anybody has? Interesting. I don't know whether you know much about the Vernacular Society, which I've just looked it up on the internet. 1942 to 1989, it existed. Somebody in my family was a member of it. Just a matter of interest. So I don't know whether that was significant at all.
And sometimes too, trying to find those societies' archives can be challenging. To a certain degree, they are
university
in the diocesan archives, but sometimes it's hard to find. For example, like the Catholic Women's Society, a lot of that stuff's at Liverpool. But if you want to try to find the local stuff, you're kind of fishing around to see what local communities might still be around and have their material.
Yes, yeah, I think there is material available, but as I say, I remember somebody say my family talking about it, and but I can't remember what he said now. It's a very long time ago, but I remember him saying something about it anyway. Okay, brilliant. Well, that was fascinating talk. And lots of interesting ideas there. I hadn't thought much about these things at all before. This is not something I've really thought about at all. But fascinating. Thank you very much, Joshua, for your illuminating talk, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. I think the comments in the chat box seem to indicate that people did enjoy it and found it interesting in lots of different ways. So thank you very much. If I may just mention forthcoming talks that we have as well is the next one, Tuesday, the 6th of February. They're always on Tuesdays, or usually are. Dr. Elizabeth Norton is a well-known writer. The Blounts of the West Midlands, an English Catholic family in the reign of Elizabeth I. That I would find that very, very interesting myself, because I'm fascinated by Catholic recusancy during the reign of Elizabeth I. And Tuesday, 5th of March, we have Professor Victor Stater, Hoax, the Popish Plot That Never Was. So that would be an interesting talk about the Popish plot and various other things of that sort. I should imagine there was a lot of strange attitude towards Catholics at that sort of period, but there's lots of reasons for it. But anyway, thank you very much, Joshua, for this excellent talk, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. And if you just want to say thank you in the box to him, you may do so. I'm sure he can see that if you'd like to. So very well done. And thank you to William, our wonderful secretary, and to Lynn as well, who've organised this thing. These things don't happen by themselves, as you know. They require people to actually do them. And they're generally people on the committee. If you're interested in joining the committee, please let us know. If you're interested in joining the association, please let us know. You're very welcome. The more people that join, the better. The more things that we can do, the better for everybody. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here this evening, and we'll see you again, hopefully, on another occasion. Bye for now.
Thank you.